So I want to talk about making invisible visible inside our bodies, around us, and beyond. I'm associate professor at MIT Media Lab, just in down the street. Um, so there are many ways to think about this problem. Like imagine if you can build a camera that can see around corners beyond line of sight, or we can see in foggy conditions as if it's a beautiful sunny day. Or we can create devices that look like a blood pressure cuff that can sit deep inside your body. So there's a lot of this is research coming out of our team here at MIT. And we also offer executive courses. If you're welcome to join, tiny.cc/MIT course. Now, one of the ways to see around corners is to conquer time. So if you take a laser pointer and turn it on and off in a fraction of a second, millisecond, nanosecond, picosecond, femtosecond, then we'll actually create a bullet of light that's extremely tiny, right? To conquer time, we have to take this bullet of light and see how we can deal with issues like noise and signal. So some of you may have seen this video from our group of shining a bullet of light inside a Coke bottle, right? And we can see the world at 1 trillion frames per second. So you can see this light in motion, right? And because the light has traveled roughly a foot of the Coke bottle, in real world, it only takes about 1 nanosecond. You have to slow down this movie by a factor of 10 billion so that we can show it to you over 10 seconds. Right? How many of you have seen this movie before? Of course, I'm going to show it again. How many have seen it before? Okay, good. So again, a bullet of light is going through this Coke bottle. There's some scattering milky water. You can see kind of energy fronts on the table. Most of the light goes through the center of the tube, hits all the way the cap, and then all the photons scatter in different directions. At the top of the bottle, you see there's an air bubble, so light is bouncing around. And also after several picoseconds, at the back of the bottle, you see kind of a focusing because of the parabolic curvature near the cap of the bottle, right? So the immediate question for us is, this is cool, but can we exploit this in completely new ways, right? So that's the ability we have in today's world, right? And then you can do cool art with this. You can time code isochrone. It's like a time lapse of the video I just showed you. Earlier photons are in blue, later photons are in yellow and red, right? And you can see the beautiful energy fronts at the bottom of the cap on the table, right? And you can use this representation for doing all kinds of computer vision and AI. Now, when we did this, about 10 years ago, the instruments looked like this. They, like a microwave-sized instruments, cost us about $1 million. But the interesting thing is almost all of that is available now in this tiny dot at the bottom of your iPhone 12 or better. Okay? All this instrumentation is available in this tiny dot, which has its own laser pointer and a photon detector. Maybe, I don't know the exact cost, but I'm guessing it's below $20. And then the images that you get from this setup are the space-time images. It's not just a photo in space, but it's a photo in space and time, right? And you can analyze the space-time images, this is over time, in all kinds of amazing ways. So let's come back to our problem of, how can you build a camera that can see around corners beyond line of sight, right? Once I explain to you, it'll be obvious how this can be done, because of course we're using this crazy, crazy, crazy camera. To do that, we're going to use multiple bounces of light. So the light bounces from the flash, bounces on the first bounces on the door, it reflects inside the room. The second bounce comes back to the door, the third bounce, and back to the camera. And by just analyzing these multiple bounces of light, which is effectively, about echoes of sound, these are echoes of light, we can see around corners and create full 3D models of that. So it's not science fiction. We actually built this, as I said, about 10 years ago, using this femto camera that I just described. And our goal is to kind of see this mannequin, around the corner. So let me show you the video. Actually, this is already 10 years old, but explains the concept really well. So every bullet of light is creating these spherical energy fronts. And every time it reflects and hits like the knee and the head and the shoulder, creates its own energy fronts. And when it comes back to the door again, right? But all these photons are reaching the camera at a slightly different time. Right? So we can probe this, very, very fast, and start looking at these echoes of light. And the amount of time it takes from the shoulder and the head and the knees will be slightly off, right? And once you've done all of that, what kind of 3D reconstruction we can do? So we can create full 3D shapes about this. Of course, this was done at 30 by 30 by 30 centimeter volume back then, about 10 years ago. But once you make it practical, you can imagine you can look for survivors in hazardous conditions by shining light through the window to see if there's any motion. And as we heard in the previous talk, if you want to avoid collision of what's around the bend, we can do this without putting people at risk. In fact, our whole perception stack has to be rewritten because now we can see around corners. The camera is not limited to seeing what's in front of you, right? And this completely changes what we mean by computer vision and AI, because if you had to do research in speech, 1,000 years ago, 200 years ago, we were just worried about speech that's across the room. Maybe you can amplify it. But now when we talk about speech, we really talk about making a phone call across continents, and with this amazing ability to think about speech, not just as you would use it in the room, but you would use it across the world. And it's the same thing with imaging now. You don't have to limit yourself to what you can see, but in the future, I might be able to shine some light and maybe create 3D model of this whole building by looking at light that's bounced around. The same way, if I yell, in an empty building, I can hear echoes of my own voice coming back from different places. You also have echoes of light coming through. Of course, we are not there yet, but we can at least see around the corners, right? And then the interesting thing is, after DARPA funded our project, they came back to us in 2015 or so and said, "This is great, but how do we take it forward?" So you're familiar with the autonomous driving challenge that DARPA spearheaded in the around 2004, 2005. So they created another challenge to see if we can build cameras that can see around corners, and a $28 million program to do that. So many teams across the country, many of them are former students who have become professors elsewhere now, ended up participating, and now there are a lot of practical systems that can see around corners. If you're interested in endoscopy, it's the same thing, right? You can see deep inside the body. And if you can conquer time down to picosecond, down to a femtosecond, then it opens up yet another array of industrial applications, like using an optical jumble brush endoscope, where the fiber tips may be disordered, but it's like picking a cookie from a cookie jar. I can close my eyes, put my hand inside, and I can feel the cookie and pick it up. So imagine kind of creating really clever robotics that can use light to communicate at the tips of it. I talked about kind of creating cellular resolution at which is about 5 micrometers at 5 millimeter depth. inside the body. Bottom right is kind of a CT scan in a rickshaw. One of the reasons the CAT scan machines are so huge, and they have about 5G or 10G of acceleration, and they are mostly in the basement, is because you need very precise movement of those of X-ray sources and detectors inside a CAT scan. But with techniques that exploit time of flight, you can have a very flexible setup. And then also fluorescence lifetime imaging that's used in medical imaging is very powerful. So if you can conquer time, effectively we can deal with scattering of light, multiple bounces of light or volumetric scattering, the depth of the scene, how far things are, and also things like fluorescence lifetime. So there are many things you can do if you can conquer time. See around corners, see through fog, create new endoscopes, fluorescence lifetime. And if you really go in the future, I think I need a glass of water. If you go in the future, then we can beat diffraction limits. We can overcome ambient light. In LiDAR, for example, you have to really worry about daytime ambient light. You can create negative light by using destructive interference or focus or heat any walk cell. You can literally create new microwaves that will heat up your food exactly in the places you want and nowhere else, for example. All right. So any questions or comments on this? I'm going to switch some topic. We have an intimate audience here. Go ahead. Right. Yeah, you need something that you can reflect off of, for sure. We're not trying to paint light in your hair. Yeah. No, you don't. That's fine. So you can from your traditional imaging, you can figure out tree shape or the property of what you're looking at. So in case of a vehicle, if it was your corners, you would just shine light on the street, and the light from the street will bounce off into different regions, and then it will come back, hit the street again, and back to your sensor. And in that case, you may not know what kind of a street you have. Is it asphalt, is it gravel, and so on, but that's perfectly fine because you can see it yourself. So you have a model of what that is. Yeah. Go ahead.
What's the limiting factor here? Is it how fast you can process the light spectrum?
Yeah, very good question. So what are the limits, right? First of all, you need really good time resolution. Today's LiDARs are nanoseconds to sub-nanoseconds, which may or may not be fast enough for some of this. We think it's good enough for doing simple tests, like is there a motion or not? So some of the companies we talk to, they are worried about, hey, we have these vehicles, but if a kid jumps in front of the car, there's hardly any time. As a human, you have a mental model, like, do I expect to have kids running around here? Or do I expect to have, a bicyclist just going to cut me off? So you have a mental model, but a vehicle may or may not have that mental model. If it's like, if it's October 31st and it's Halloween, we have a mental model, like, you know what? All kinds of strange people are going to be on the street. Or, if the Celtics game is over in front of the stadium, you're like, okay, this is going to be a completely different day that, I had no training data from a machine because it wasn't trained on a Halloween day where people looked strange. And, all my models are for this particular types of pedestrians, but on Halloween, none of those models work, right? So you might want to kind of use these mechanisms to kind of see ahead, this look ahead. The look ahead for any planning and perception can be a huge benefit. In terms of challenges, time resolution, ambient light can still kill you if it's too bright, which is true for LiDAR as well. If you have highly reflective objects like a bunch of mirrors and shiny things, if you're like in a house of mirrors, it could confuse you because light is bouncing around. You don't know which one it is. Same problem with LiDAR. Going back to the surface, if the surface is completely kind of matte black, like photography black, that would be a challenge because there's nothing scattering around. So many limitations in that sense. In terms of the processing, this is kind of the hardware. In terms of processing, my team and others have published a whole series of papers in different algorithmic ways to overcome that. But there's still some limitations of what you can and cannot see around the corner. So for example, if you have a big object that you're seeing around the corner and then So that's around the corner, and there's a smaller object behind it, not behind, but kind of adjacent to it. There's some theoretical bounds to what you can recover and cannot recover from it. But that's kind of 2022 science. I'm sure in a few years we'll be able to do other things. In terms of hardware, it's still very primitive. It's single wavelength. You're looking at time of flight, but you would imagine in the future you'll have multiple wavelengths. Even RF that's embedded in it, and you would use like different spectrums. And so I think the innovation in this space will continue to do amazing things, because if you remember original radio frequency, like your phone would work only if it can see the tower. And now our phones work even if we are in a building and complex scenarios, because we have these notions of MIMOs, because the tower is not sending just one signal, it's sending multiple signals, and you're actually exploiting the multipath to be able to reach the smartphone. It's the same thing here. I think that field has developed very nicely over the last 15, 20 years of how to exploit multiple paths to go from a tower to a phone without being in the line of sight. And I think in optical domain, it's the same thing. We have to break this the notion that camera should be as good as human vision. No, there should be superhuman vision, way, way, way beyond what human eyes can see. And if you think about the AI problems, it's the same thing. Like almost everything we're building in computer vision and machine learning is based on trying to match human vision with cameras that are roughly like the human vision, with a few other things like radar and LiDAR and so on. But nevertheless, the assumption is that it should be as good as human vision. But in reality, we can go well beyond that.
In your experience, adoption by the industry, is it more supported right now on the hardware development, or is it more around exploration of use cases where the future is?
Yeah, it's a good question, because there's the classic trade-off between hardware and software. Industry is much better at moving in software very quickly. You can hire a whole bunch of engineers, and they can just go for it. When it comes to the real world, like all the way from capturing data, using new devices, even worse, capturing data with newer devices, and there's so many vendors and so many possibilities, and people like us are throwing even more complexity by creating this, new inventions. When will they get actually commercialized? When will they actually be available in the market? So it adds a lot of complexity to that ecosystem, and we are not doing any favors by making the choices even more broad, without actually providing all the algorithms to exploit. So I think this is a very interesting ecosystem. That's why if you think about other industries like space and transportation, most of the innovation happen actually in software. And then at some point, someone says, let's just redesign the rocket, or let's just redesign what kind of vehicle it is, and so on. I think when it comes to computer vision, I think we have a similar problem. Like the innovations in hardware are much slower than in software. But if you're an entrepreneur, if you're a corporate venture, maybe that's the blue ocean. By innovating in hardware, you're going to give yourself an extra 5 to 10 years of blue ocean runway, as opposed to innovating only in software. Yes? Yeah, a very good question. So I'll talk a little bit more about single photon sensing. Unfortunately, if you do it naively, it could be multiple gigabytes per second just from one sensor, right? Because we're trying to capture each photon, and it arrives, right? And think about how many photons are here, right? There are too many of them. So if you try to measure every photon, then yeah, it becomes unwieldy. And so what I'll talk about a little bit more is better onboard processing that converts this stream of photons into something that actually matters in the end, right? So the analogy would be, if you have a CD, then the actual speech signal would require kind of 44 kilohertz of sampling, but the sound that comes out is just analog in some sense. So we are not really listening at 44 kilohertz, 44 kilobits per second. All right. I think I said something, so room is filling up. That's good. All right. So let's think about this notion of single photon imaging, right? It's a very powerful concept that most people are not familiar with. And again, those devices are available in your pocket right now. So when you think about a single photon, and you start measuring this photon. Imagine somebody's throwing you tennis balls, and you're trying to capture them on a sensor, right? So you have a source, you transmit a pulse, it hits the scene, right? And then you measure, how much time it took to receive that light, right? That's how LiDAR works. That's a lot of time of flight 3D cameras work. And then it's very simple math. You just divide by the speed of light, and you get the distance, right? So if you know the time, speed of light, you get the distance to the scene. That's kind of classic method. And this is being used in many, many places, right? You have commercial devices, you have many applications, in autonomous vehicles, industrial automation, AR, robotics, and so on. And now the way to think about single photon imaging is not just for traditional imaging, like 3D imaging, like LiDARs, which is the leftmost, but it's useful in many other areas, like fluorescence lifetime, where there is a decay in how the fluorophores are emitting their energy, or scattering media, where you shine light, and of course, which could be your tissue, or it could be fog, in case of vehicles. Light goes and it's going to get a very nice decay over time, but then it hits a particular point of interest. So if there's a pedestrian, the light is going to hit that pedestrian at some point, and you're going to get a spike. Right? That's the one you see in this third chart there. So you have a nice decay, but has a small spike. Or what I'm talking about, like non-line of sight imaging, kind of seeing around corners, you're going to get this really strange profile because of scattering, but you can use mathematical inversion to reconstruct that. So it's kind of interesting to think that if you start thinking at one photon at a time, so x-axis is time, and vertical axis is how many photons you're capturing within that time window, a tiny time window, right? So those of you who think about machine learning from images, this is like a whole new dimension you have to think about to exploit this type of data, right? So as I said, this technology is not new. It has been around. There are commercial devices that you can buy. Unfortunately, they're still kind of research grade. They're not available, and this company doesn't give you a direct access to what's happening on board, but that this is happening. This is coming very soon, right? So what's happening, right? So the challenges, the benefits are extreme sensitivity, one photon at a time, right? So you can see in pitch dark. You can use this at room temperature, no problem at all. And it's compatible with CMOS technology. You don't have to do anything fancy. It's not like thermal IR or shortwave IR or RF or sonar. It's just standard CMOS technology that's extremely efficient to build this. It's very low cost and compact, right? So kind of the obvious notion of this is if you can capture one photon at a time, then you can see in pitch dark. I'll show you some examples. You have extremely wide dynamic range because you can decide, like when the very one faint, in a faint scene, like very first photon comes up, I can record that. And in a bright scene, if I start getting too many photons, I can just ignore them, right? So automatically I get very high dynamic range. And fast motion is not a problem because even if there's something moving fast, because I'm capturing at 1 trillion frames per second, effectively, there's not much that moves that fast except light, right? So you can literally capture light in motion, and everything else is just walk in the park, right? As you can see, in astronomy, it's already being used, these PAD sensors. You can do face recognition, you can do object recognition, automotive, and so on. I'll try to motivate this. So the first question you would have is, what do the images from the sensors look like? Because the photons are hitting at random time. Like even if I'm looking at a particular object, from that particular point, the photons are coming to my camera at a random time, just stochastically. What does images look like, right? So here's what the image looks like. This is like a 2,000 frames per second video in a scene that has 0.03 photons per pixel. So imagine at you have to kind of see, 300 frames, right, before you see one photon, right? So in most of the frames, there's nothing. So you just kind of see this salt and pepper type noise, but actually if you just take an average of all those 2,000 frames, then it would look like an ordinary image. By the way, a lot of this work is from my colleague, Professor Mohit Gupta, and I'll show you a few slides from his work. Go ahead. Yeah, just imagine this like a 1 megapixel sensor, and every time a photon hits a pixel, you say, ah, I got a photon. And then it waits for the next frame out of the 2000 frames. Next photon comes, like, I got something at this x1, y1, I got something at this x2, y2. So in a regular camera, you might have like let's say it's running at 30 frames per second. You have 30 milliseconds. Then at a given pixels, you just keep accumulating the photons. And then at the end of 30 milliseconds, you say, oh, I got 2,000 photons, and my buddy here at neighboring pixel only got 1,000 photons, so I'm brighter than that guy. So there's this notion of accumulation in a typical CCD or CMOS, as opposed to this one where every photon is creating an event. And the brighter the scene is, the event is happening more frequently, which also means that within the 2,000 frames per second, which is 0.05, 0.5 milliseconds, is, 2,000 frames, yeah, so 0.5 milliseconds. If 2 photons arrive within that one window, we still count that only once. We don't count as 2, right? So if there are too many photons, we just start ignoring them. Like, we don't care. We got abundance of photons. But if you get something in one frame and nothing for several frames, the rest of the frames in the middle are just black, and then you get another one. So it's kind of a strange way to think about, capturing light. So if I take a camera and move it around, then each image might look very, very noisy. Again, things that are dark will have very few dots, and things that are bright, like the Taj Mahal in the middle, you'll see it more bright, right? And the question is, if I just average it, all those pictures, then I'll see a blurred image of the Taj Mahal. But if I do something clever, then I'll see a much sharper image, right? And as you can see, the idea is to align and merge. So if you can do optical flow and image registration, for every one of those 2,000 frames, and then average them, this is what happens. By the way, this is what exactly your Android or iOS smartphone does. If there's low light, it's taking a whole bunch of pictures and aligning each of those pictures and giving you a fusion of those pictures, right? So this is exactly what it is, align and merge, which is an age-old strategy in low light conditions, right? The question is, can you do this even when you have this really, like when iPhone or Android phone smartphones are doing it, every frame still has a reasonable image, it's just that it's more noisy. So it's okay to align and merge because you have enough optical flow you can compute. But here you don't have that luxury. So Gupta and his team have done a lot of work on new types of algorithms to create these extremely high quality images, although you're measuring singular photons. Right? And then again with you would say, why not use short exposure, long exposure? The problem is if you have long exposure, in this case, the number 5 on the board inside the tunnel is completely washed out. If you take a short exposure, then signs outside are very blurred. And the benefit of this is that there's really no notion of low light or overexposed. It all fits within the dynamic range of the sensor. So there's a company in Cambridge here that was spun out of my group called Ubicept, and they're doing all kinds of interesting things with this single photon detectors. So if you're in this in this world of complex imaging, autonomous vehicles, drones, industrial imaging, medical imaging, all kinds of applications that are very challenging, whether it's low light, high-speed motion, long range, computer vision, perception, in crazy scenarios, just ping him. It's Sebastian at ubicept.com. All right, any questions so far? Go ahead.
How do you think about this in terms of like the processing requirements, the memory needed to do something like this? Is this way different than what we had out there today?
Very good question, and sorry I didn't answer the earlier question about the bandwidth. So as I said, every photon is creating an event. And so you can easily get overwhelmed with the number of events that are occurring. So you need to put logic very close to the sensor to decide what you want to do. You just want a regular 30 frame per second video out of this, or do you want to run perception, like face recognition or pedestrian detection or counting or whatever tasks there are, or seeing around corners? How much logic you want to put close to the sensor is actually a very, very complicated task, and that's non-trivial, because effectively you're trying to implement algorithms in a most efficient manner that's very close to the sensor chip. So a lot of the work that Sebastian's team does is in that transformation from single photon events to what really matters, which is perception. Yes. No. Yeah, I mean, it's a slightly different question than what I'm talking about, but we should never bet against smartphone cameras, because the market forces to improve a smartphone camera. I mean, most ads on billboards for phones is about cameras. They're not about making a phone call anymore, right? So there are a lot of market forces that are pushing us to invent, but the form factor is a challenge, and I would say the two main challenges that remain for smartphones is low light and zoom. I think if you can solve those two benefits of SLR, then SLR probably are kind of dead. But those are non-trivial problems to solve. Yes. You said zooming?
It's zooming into the concept.
Yeah.
Since an event is produced at every photon,
Yeah.
then the concept of zooming, all light, you can focus on
The optics doesn't change. We're only playing with the time.
Yeah.
So, if I have a camera and I'm looking at, if pixel X1, Y1 is looking in that direction, pixel X2, Y2 is looking in that direction, that is not really changing. So my zoom is not changing, my focus is not changing. So anything to do with optics is not changing. What's changing is the time, which allows you to play with things like motion blur, things like low light, things like dynamic range, and so on. So yeah, zoom is kind of orthogonal to these inventions, these innovations.
No problem, but my question is around if this actually becomes something that we adopt more widely,
Right.
then would essentially have it will do more widely?
No. So zoom is basically, what kind of optics you can build, basically focal length, and also how small can your pixels become with it. So the combination of the two is actually what gives you zoom, right? The optical zoom and the digital zoom. One could argue that you can make your pixels arbitrarily small, to pack, as much as you want. But then you get into issues like quantum efficiency and so on. But it's a valid point. I mean, somebody should be thinking about using this extremely low light sensor to create extremely high resolution detectors. I mean, right now, iPhone went from 12 megapixel to 48, which is splitting one pixel into 2 by 2, basically, right? Into 4 pixels, which means they're getting 4 times less light per pixel compared to the phones last year, which means they have to improve their performance roughly by a factor of 4. Clearly, they cannot, because they were already at the limits of how well they can perform. But unless they switch to a technology like this, there's a limit to how much they can continue to split each pixel. Yes. Say the question again. A direct delta? Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you're talking about direct delta, but the direct delta comes more for sampling, and these are all Poisson events. So in Poisson events, you have these random events in terms of the statistics of it. And the interesting part about that is when you're doing the denoising, you cannot use the standard Gaussian assumptions that you use with the traditional camera. So the denoising, like the whole image processing pipeline that everybody's familiar with, completely goes out of the window, because the events I showed you are all Poisson events. So you cannot use traditional Gaussian methods to the denoising. You cannot use the traditional demosaicing. A lot of the stuff we do in a standard image processing pipeline don't work. Yes? Yeah, the question was, what's the limit? What's the lowest SNR you can handle with? And those calculations are pretty straightforward to do, actually. So you can just measure your SNR, and you can calculate that your inherent noise of your sensor, which is usually a short noise or photon counting noise, and you can just say if it's below that, pedestal of the noise that I'm creating, just the fact that it's an electronic device and there's heat and there's photon counting noise, there's nothing below this that I can recover. So those limits are very well understood. And then you would have to use other tricks like cooling the device or using a much larger pixel or things like that. So those tricks are orthogonal to this trick of capturing each photon. All right. So, if you want to look at invisible objects, so as I said, we can read a book without opening it page by page, right? So, I subscribe to USPS and they send me an email every time mail is supposed to come to my house. Have many of you signed up to that? It's a great service. But I wish they would just tell me what's inside the documents as well, just like without opening my envelope. And clearly you cannot do that with light because light will not penetrate a book. So we use terahertz for this. So here's a video from our team. So in this case, we have about 9 letters. We're just going to stack them. So think about like a 9-page book in this case. And we're going to terahertz and do a time of flight measurement for each of this. And from every page, we're going to get a reflection for this, right? So we have, THZ, terahertz, camera culture group, and so on. And we can see each of these letters being pulled, from this stack of pages. So this is fascinating because, we can see those 9 pages on the left, and then we can pull out each of these letters. As you start going to the page 8 or 9, which is the letter C and G at the bottom right, of course the signal gets very, very faint, right? And so we have to train kind of a machine learning models with OCR to start extracting. So the top 3 letters, T, H, Z, are very easy to recover. And what's happening here is that the paper, the air, and the ink, each of them have a slightly different refractive index. So light reflects from each of them with a slightly different efficiency. So that's what's happening, right? If you use X-rays, it'll just see through the book and we won't see the letters at all. But if you use terahertz, then the paper, ink, and air, which is all roughly 5 to 25 micrometers of thickness, we can still recover that. And then finally, to see through fog, we can use things like LiDAR, things like this single photon detectors, and on the left you'll see kind of what you would see through during fog, right? And in the middle, you can see how we can actually recover, in this case, the mannequin, sufficiently well. But because we also have the time of flight, we can also get depth to that. And the idea is actually surprisingly simple. We, the actual waveform that we see on the left is basically the background, which is light coming from the fog, and then a tiny signal that's riding on top of it. That's because of the object, right? In this case, the pedestrian or the mannequin. And all we have to do is kind of separate those 2 waveforms, one by using the gamma distribution, one using the normal distribution, and that allows us to do the separation. So to conclude, a lot of things we do in our group at MIT are making the invisible visible. In the bottom row is kind of inside our bodies, new types of tissue imaging. I didn't talk about it, but kind of looking at, we call it eye selfie, looking at yourself and your eyes, new types of CAT scan machine. I talked about objects, reading through a book, seeing around corners, seeing through fog. And the top row, which I didn't get to talk about today, about new notions of automated machine learning. So our group co-invented the idea of meta-learning or automated machine learning by doing hyperparameter search as well as architecture search. We also invented another method called split learning. If you're familiar with the notion of federated learning for privacy-preserving machine learning, there's an alternative we invented called split learning. And actually, most major companies now use a combination of federated learning and split learning. And then finally, a very new research area called data markets, which is, AI needs data, and data is often siloed, and the entities that have the data may not want to sell it. The folks who want to buy the data may not be able to afford it, or they don't know which data is good. So we need to create data exchanges. And algorithmically, can you actually evaluate the dollar value of any data set? So we have algorithms to do that in a privacy preserving way, which is, if there's a hospital that's selling data to a pharma company, or there's a street data collection company selling the data to an autonomous vehicle company, how do you evaluate their data? Because if you copy their data and then evaluate, maybe it's too late. It can be copied and say, hey, I don't want your data, but you already have a copy of it. So how can you do this without asking them to send the data to a central location? So we think kind of making the invisible visible through computer vision and AI is an exciting challenge for us. So we invite you to come and be in touch. That's my email address, raskar@mit.edu. Thank you. We still have a few minutes for questions. Yes? So they're not super widely available, but they're used in many different applications. So for example, e-commerce companies are using them to see if the products being shipped are fake or not, because X-rays may or may not tell them exactly what's going on inside. So terahertz is becoming another mechanism to do that. So the cost is coming down dramatically. It used to be a couple of $100,000. Now it's below $100,000. It's like LiDARs. They used to be $60,000, $70,000, and now they're what? $5,000? What's the cost now? It's getting there. So it's exciting. Yes, the principle is very similar to LiDAR, by the way. Yeah, no, terahertz is terahertz. So, somewhere around 100 micrometers. Light is well below, like around 1 micrometer. So terahertz is like 100 times fatter in terms of its wavelength. So it cannot see things at as high resolution as light. But it's better than RF, which is extremely poor resolution for any kind of imaging tasks. So this is much better than that. There's a whole industry of how you convert terahertz into a measurable signal. Some of them convert from terahertz to optical signals. Some of them convert terahertz straight to electrical signals, and so on. So it's like a whole industry that's looking at different ways to reduce the cost. It's the same thing as thermal IR. Like, how do you measure thermal IR? Do you measure directly as heat, or do you convert, thermal IR is like 10 micrometer in wavelength, approximately, or do you convert that into a change resistance and measure the current, or do you convert that into optical signals? So there are many techniques that folks use for sensing thermal IR as well. It's the same thing with terahertz. It's electromagnetic radiation. Thank you. Yeah. It's along the EM spectrum. It's not sonar. Yes. Absolutely. So if you're familiar with optical coherence tomography or synthetic aperture radars, so all these imaging methods, which are mostly outside the world of AI for some reason, right? Because people have just not realized how powerful these methods are. And there are multi-billion-dollar businesses that are built on this type of sensing, right? And a lot of machine learning techniques haven't reached there yet because there's just not enough data, or students at universities never even see that. As an example, these things still cost 100,000 plus in many cases, and so on. So coming back to your question about what does the signal look like, it looks like an optical coherence tomography signal, which is terahertz go in, and they reflect from each layer, and so you get a waveform. So if there's something at one layer, you get a bounce from there, you get a bounce from the next layer, bounce from the next layer, and so that's kind of one-dimensional signal along one ray, and then as you're scanning it over the area, you get signals from every point. So you basically get this volumetric signal, X, Y, and Z, but it's not really Z because it's the time dimension. So it's X, Y, and time is what you get. But you can interpret that in a loose way as an X, Y, and Z. The challenge is that it's not really Z because when the terahertz or even OCT, when it goes in, there's some scattering of light. So, you have to convert that into a meaningful signal. And as you saw, for the book, if you have something on page 1, it's going to occlude what's on the page 2. So if what you get from page 2 is dependent on what was on page 1. So you have to do this iterative removal of sources to say, oh, I got the first signal and I'm getting 0.7 attenuation. So when I get my next page 2, I'm going to actually scale it up back by 0.7 because the poor guy was occluded by the first guy by 0.7 attenuation. So you have to kind of do this iterative reconstruction as opposed to saying, hey, I got this nice XYZ volume, I can work with it. Yes, so we have to basically model the propagation of light based on the iterative measurements we have for each layer. And the simplifying assumption, it's called Born approximation, is that the upper layers only affect the layers below it. It's possible that page 2 affects page 1 as well, because when the light from page 2 comes back up, it's also messing around with signal from page 1. But the general approximation is that, stuff only affects stuff, pages only affect what's below it, but not above it. Which is the same assumption they make in OCT. OCT you might have used when you do like a retinal imaging and also some industrial applications for that. Anybody here working in non-standard RGB cameras? Okay, that proves my point. That this is an emerging opportunity, completely blue ocean. So if your R&D team has enough cash sitting on the side, I know it's a recession and so on, but if you have cash available, these are the kind of opportunities that are going to create like a whole new stream of AI and computer vision. One final question. All right, thank you very much.